Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to join my colleagues who have spoken before me to add my commendation and my congratulations to the Honourable Member, the Minister of Finance, for the budget presented to this Honourable House on the 29th of January, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with an earlier promise that he had made to present the budget in the first month of the fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, others have spoken on the utility and the value of presenting an earlier budget, a budget early in the year, so there's no need for me to go into that. Mr. Speaker, that this budget at $230 billion is the biggest ever presented is not by and of itself reason to celebrate or to boast. But the reasons to boast for this budget, Mr. Speaker, is that it is a bold budget, it is a brave budget, and it is a balanced budget. Mr. Speaker, with reference to the last of these three, my reference to balance, Mr. Speaker, is not, as the accountants would use the term, as in balancing a budget, but a budget that has equity and fairness. And this is why I say balance, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a budget, as we all know, is a financial plan. And Budget 2016 is a plan for development. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2016 addresses, confronts, and invests in the challenges facing our country. With its projected fiscal deficit at 4.7% of the GDP, this budget, when approved and when the allocations have been spent, will inject a massive stimulus in the economy. This is a budget that invests in people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member Mustafa, when he spoke 2 days ago, had urged and implored for the government to come with a program, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, here is a plan, here is a program. But to be able to recognize it, Mr. Speaker, we need to be objective and dispassionate. Qualities that I venture to say, Mr. Speaker, that are in very short supply in this Honourable House. After all, Mr. Speaker, we are here in the National Assembly, not at a political rally. Mr. Speaker, on this question of the fiscal deficit, the first speaker on the government side had urged exactly that with reference to the 2015 budget, that the fiscal deficit could have been greater. And in this regard, Mr. Speaker, I note that when the Honourable Member, Mr. Irfan Ali, spoke, that he was very measured in his critique of the economy, and to which he referred to as slipping and sliding. But unfortunately, the subsequent speakers painted a doomsday scenario. Among those speakers, Mr. Speaker, are the Honourable Members Dharamlal, Damon, Mahadev, Neen Kumar, Gill, Anamaya, Chandapal, Ganga. They all painted a very dim portrait of this budget, Mr. Speaker, and could find no good in this budget. Mr. Speaker, listening to the Honourable Members, it would be unforgivable for one to not recall that when this administration took office, the National Assembly had not met for 11 months as a result of it being in recess, prorogation, and dissolution, which caused to throw the financial management of our country into a tailspin. But yet, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance and his team of dedicated and committed public servants were able to produce and present 2 budgets within 7 months. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2016 is a renewal of the social contract with our people by investing in their development. This process, Mr. Speaker, it's an endless one. It never stops. One budget goes into another. And in this regard, I recall the words of the late US President, John F. Kennedy, who pointed out that all governments have to contend with the revolution of rising expectations. Mr. Speaker, the new government that came into being following the elections of May 2015, created a new ministry, the Ministry of Communities. And while many pretended to not know what a community is, Mr. Speaker, I must point out that we live in communities, that everywhere there are community centers, and we belong to something called the Caribbean community. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Communities incorporates 2 former ministries, namely Housing and Water and Local Government and Regional Development. The reason for the creation of this ministry, Mr. Speaker, was to seek to ensure that there's a more efficient delivery of government services, that with one ministry there would be better coordination. Mr. Speaker, the intention was clear, that people's welfare is to be the center and to the focus of development. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Minister Valerie Patterson, addressed the vision and plans for housing in her presentation on Monday. And Minister Dawn Hastings-Williams will elaborate on those for the water sector during her presentation. But permit me, Mr. Speaker, to briefly touch on these sectors. Providing quality and affordable housing solutions. Mr. Speaker, the previous government did not allow the board of the CHNPA to fully execute its functions. In reality, that board was treated as an ornament and was not allowed to exercise their regulatory oversight of the entity. The hand of control and domination of the minister was heavy, and the excesses were many. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Minister Valerie Patterson, highlighted the level of inefficiency, excesses, and poor service this executive dominance resulted in, and residents suffered as zoning and building regulations and construction standards were disregarded. This APNU plus AFC administration will pursue a vastly different approach. Mr. Speaker, under this government, the board of the CHNPA has been given the mandate to function with the authority it has under the Housing Act. It has begun to exercise greater oversight of the operations of the CHNPA. 3 subcommittees of the board have been constituted to facilitate executive board oversight of operations of the CHNPA. These subcommittees, Mr. Speaker, are for planning on projects, finance, and allocations, and they have begun their work in earnest. This, Mr. Speaker, will ensure that the more than $5.8 billion from the Housing Fund that has been programmed in this 2016 budget gets implemented more efficiently and transparently. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Minister Patterson, also in her presentation, spoke of the odious inheritance that this administration has inherited and committed this administration that we will fix the housing problems with lasting solutions, that this administration will give value for money, that we will make the application process more user-friendly, that applicants will be able to obtain information on the internet. And earlier this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, the assurance was given by the Honourable Minister, Cathy Hughes, that with the telecoms liberalization, that the bandwidth will be in place to allow for faster internet connectivity. In her very passionate address, Mr. Speaker, Very significant, Mr. Speaker, Minister Patterson also made the point that the work in relation to housing allocations will allow for greater involvement of local authorities, and this is consistent with the administration's policy of decentralization. Water. Mr. Speaker, promoting integrated water resources management. Integrated Water Resources Management, or IWRM, Mr. Speaker, has three critical pillars. These are participation, integration, and decentralization. Mr. Speaker, participation of the community in the decision-making process, integration with the various sector agencies involved in the exploitation of this resource, and decentralization. The latter of these, Mr. Speaker, is perhaps the most important one, in that it allows for people's involvement in the decision-making process at the local watershed level. And this is another example of returning power to the people. Mr. Speaker, the current El Nino conditions that is severely impacting on the well-being across communities demonstrate the need for the IWRM approach. Mr. Speaker, it is no coincidence, therefore, that for the first time in Guyana's history, presented before this Honorable House is a budget dedicated to IWRM. Mr. Speaker, the government has also budgeted $28.5 million for the reconstitution of the National Water Council. Mr. Speaker, I now turn my attention to the areas of local government and regional development. Mr. Speaker, there are three words that encapsulates this government's approach and attitude towards local government and regional development. And these are decentralization, empowerment, and communitarianism. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Communities has responsibility for the conditions in communities countrywide. We will, however, exercise that responsibility not directly from the ministry as used to obtain in the previous dispensation, Mr. Speaker, but rather via 81 local democratic organs. These being our 10 RDCs, soon to be 9 municipalities, and 62 NDCs, or Neighborhood Democratic Councils. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Member Hamilton, who is not in the House at this moment, when he spoke 2 days ago, Mr. Speaker, among other things, he said that he could find that there was no funding for local government in this budget. And he said that there were no transfers via the Fiscal Transfers Act. The clear imputation or implication, Mr. Speaker, is that this government is not supportive of local government or of local democracy. But, Mr. Speaker, if we can, for a moment, put aside the fact that that comment or accusation is coming from a party that denied citizens of this country their constitutional right to practice local democracy, and so damaged and degraded our local government organs, literally rendering them dysfunctional. If we can overlook that, Mr. Speaker, I can proudly point to our track record in the 8 months that we have been in office. I'll get to that. Mr. Speaker, in the 8 months that we have been in office, we have passed legislation to facilitate the holding of local government elections. And we have gone further and named the date for the holding of local government elections, which will be in another 6 weeks from today. And Mr. Speaker, what is the price tag? Thank you for the protection that you are seeking to afford me, Mr. Speaker, and I trust that honorable members on the other side will will heed your caution. Mr. Speaker, I was saying, what is the price tag for these elections? Because the honourable member, Mr. Hamilton, wants to know if this government is putting its money where its mouth is. And Mr. Speaker, these elections, when held, would have cost the administration more than $1,300 million, $1.3 billion. But Mr. Speaker, that is an investment in good governance. It deepens the democratic process. And those are concepts that we are committed to. But to turn to the Fiscal Transfers Act, Mr. Speaker, Honourable Member Nandlal is curious. Mr. Speaker, Honourable Member Hamilton obviously did not take the time to familiarize himself with the details of that act. But I venture to say that had he consulted his colleague on his left, the Honourable Member Crowell, or former Minister, Honourable Member Mr. G. Prasad, they would have, Honourable Member Prasad, they would have informed him that this Fiscal Transfers Act does not mandate the central government to provide funding to local government organs, but rather it outlines a formula for organs to access budgetary allocations once they have been made, such allocations being entirely discretionary, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with local government elections and with the elections of 71 new councils all across the country, it will be accompanied by this new philosophy that sees central government providing support as opposed to seeking to dictate to and dominate the affairs of local government organs. Mr. Speaker, the hand of control has been replaced with the hand of collaboration, cooperation. Mr. Speaker, the crisis conditions that currently characterizes our towns and villages will be replaced by community renewal when people are allowed to practice their constitutional right to manage and develop their areas. And this is what I mean, Mr. Speaker, when I referred a moment ago to communitarianism. What we will have is community solidarity, and we have to return to the period, to the time when we were each other's brothers' keepers and sisters' keepers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fresh approach to community management will see partnership, not partisanship. We'll see a respect. We'll see respect, not a desire to dominate. Mr. Speaker, the present rotten local government system will be rehabilitated. The degeneration of our communities will give way to rebirth and renewal when local leaders are elected and allowed to make decisions on those areas that directly affect their well-being. Mr. Speaker, one only has to look at the physical transformation that is taking place in our capital city right before our very eyes as a result of this changed mindset to the role of local government, to appreciate the wisdom and necessity of empowering people to manage their own affairs. And Mr. Speaker, even though the Honourable Member Chandapal, when she spoke, sought to disparage and denigrate the actions of the City Council and sought to suggest that they were not desirous of improving the conditions of the city, I venture to say that you are closing your eyes to reality, Honourable Member. And Mr. Speaker, the physical transformation that we are seeing in our city was as a result of a 2015 budgetary allocation of a meager $300 million in comparison to the question again was earlier asked that when this House, this Honourable House, passed $1 billion in the 2014 budget, what is there to show for it? Mr. Speaker, also accompanying the new councils that will come into being following those elections will be the Local Government Commission, a legislation that was approved in this House way back in 2013, but that was not operationalized up until the elections of May of last year. But funding is provided in this budget for the Local Government Commission, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that this commission will allow for, Mr. Speaker, is that it will allow for overtime for politics to be taken out of the management of our communities. Because it is the case, Mr. Speaker, that too often that the rancor that accompanies political cut and trust affects and prevents community-minded persons from coming forward to play a role in managing and developing their communities, Mr. Speaker. So the operationalization of the Local Government Commission will be further proof of our commitment to introducing meaningful local democracy. Mr. Speaker, rebuilding the capacity within local government organs will not be simple, nor will it be an overnight task. But this administration is committed to this end. The incoming councils, Mr. Speaker, will require significant support to execute their mandate. And in this regard, the Ministry of Communities will follow a policy of collaboration with local and international agencies and groups to achieve the goal of equipping and empowering those organs, Mr. Speaker. One such partnership is with the Canadian-funded Caribbean Local Economic Development Initiative, CARILED. Under this partnership, 6 municipal development plans are being updated, and the new councils, when installed, will be invited to further refine these plans into plans of action for municipal development. Under the same program, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry is exploring with the e-governance unit the options of developing a common IT platform for financial and administrative management across our local government organs. Mr. Speaker, local government elections aside, the single most significant challenge for our local democratic organs is the matter of how these councils will finance their activities to be able to effectively discharge their responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. It is no secret that the financial status of our councils is a devastated one. Many are unable to meet their operational costs. This is largely as a result of the fact that property valuations and revaluations have not been done since 1995. Collections rates are low, and the revenue base of councils are restricted. Mr. Speaker, this administration is committed to ensuring that our newly elected councils have adequate financial resources to discharge their responsibility. Mr. Speaker, other initiatives that are in place to support our local government organs include the SLED initiative, Sustainable Livelihood and Entrepreneurial Development. This is a program that is targeted at stimulating local areas' economic growth by promoting micro and small-scale enterprises among the disadvantaged in our communities. Budgeted in this 2016 budget, Mr. Speaker, it provides for local area economic profiles which will provide the targeted local councils with data to promote local economic development, and the sum of $40 million is provided for in Budget 2016. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry will continue to assist and equip our municipalities and NDCs to execute their responsibilities. To this end, the sum of $400 million is budgeted under the Project Development and Assistance Subvention for this year. It will cater, in addition, for additional support to our 3 new townships, these being Bartica, Lethem, and Mabaruma. Mr. Speaker, as we continue to build capacity within our local government organs to deliver on the good life, the Community Infrastructure Improvement Program will continue to provide local councils with assistance to enhance the aesthetic community facilities and to preserve and construct community infrastructure. CIP. Mr. Speaker, in pursuing the fresh approach, day-to-day management of the community enhancement workers component was transferred to the local government organs in Linden, Mabaruma, and Letem in 2015. And in 2016, the ministry will extend this approach to all of our neighborhood democratic councils and municipalities. And this is what we mean by decentralization and empowerment, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the honourable member be given 5 minutes more as an extension to his allotted time.
I thank the Honourable Member. Honourable Member, you would now speak for 35 minutes, a total of 35 minutes. Thank you.
I turn to regional administration and development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member Mustafa, when he spoke, accused the administration, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, of taking control of our regions. He said that the administration was appointing officials who were usurping the role and functions of elected officials, that there was excessive interference, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, other and similar accusations were made by other honourable members, including Honourable Member Dharamlal, Damon, Mahadev, Mr. Harry Gill, even Honourable Member Ganga Prasad. Mr. Speaker, one of the lament was the fact that approximately 20% of the capital allocations for 2015 for our regions was returned. Mr. Speaker, I will admit that that is regrettable, but what is the reality? It is that a mere 4 months was available to execute the capital program as a result of the prorogation. And when one considers...
Honourable Members, the Speaker has the power to name members. Were I a member of this Assembly as not in the position of Speaker, I would be embarrassed if I'm named. I'm trying to avoid visiting that on any member. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you would have recognized that it has become a common occurrence anytime I attempt to speak in this honourable House, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when one considers the process of inviting public tendering, the evaluation and the award of contracts, and the bottlenecks of the tender board, and the need for the reconstitution of our regional tender boards, these were some of the factors that were responsible for that unfortunate state of affairs, Mr. Speaker. But if there is any blame to be cast, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that blame belongs at the feet of the honourable members on the other side of this House. Mr. Speaker, however, for the 2015 current allocations, I am pleased to note that 98.5% of those allocations were spent, and that if taken as a whole, the current and capital allocations for the 2015 budget, the sum of 97% was spent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, however, the tabling of the 2016 budget this early will allow for its early execution and its full implementation of the capital program as well. Mr. Speaker, in relation to regional administration, our RDCs will be beneficiaries of that very strategic vision of empowerment. The creation of our 10 regions, Mr. Speaker, was not merely for the purpose of administration, but more importantly, development. Each region must be prepared to accept the challenge offered to it by the government to begin to take more ownership of their areas. Our regions, Mr. Speaker, must ensure that the bountiful natural and other resources that they are endowed with are used to attract investments, create jobs, and contribute to improving living standards, to raising people's quality of life, and to bringing about development. Mr. Speaker, our regions must no longer see themselves as administrative regions, as vehicles to soak up resources from the central government, but must rather seek to leverage their abundant resources to be able to drive development in their regions. And this is what our Constitution provides for, Mr. Speaker. Article 77 provides for each region to craft their own development program. I recall, Mr. Speaker, that when in my first budget presentation in this House in 2012, I had made that very point. I had urged the government to adopt Article 77, Mr. Speaker, and it would be there when they answered. But, Mr. Speaker, when the regional chairpersons and vice chairs were sworn in shortly after the elections of last year, they were given that very charge by President Granger, Mr. Speaker, to craft a plan of action for the development of their respective regions. Subsequent to that, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Communities, in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance and other agencies, both local and international, provided support to our regional administration, offered such support, Mr. Speaker, to their task of developing their respective PARDs. Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, His Excellency has stated emphatically that strong regions will lead to a strong nation, and meaningful support will continue to be provided to the RDCs in equipping them to exploit their potential for the benefit of their residents, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, that is the nature of the engagement that we are seeking this administration to have with our RDCs. So it is misleading, Mr. Speaker, for honourable members of this House to be peddling a false narrative, accusing us of seeking to usurp the authority. Mr. Speaker, again, in relation to the creation of the PARDs, the respective development plans, at a leadership forum that was convened by the Ministry of Communities in July of last year and held at the Arthur Chung Conference Center, a forum that was held under the theme Unveiling a Plan for Regional Empowerment. All 203 RDC councillors attended that leadership forum, Mr. Speaker. Subsequent to that, Mr. Speaker, the ministry took the lead and selected, with the agreement of Region 10, for that region to be chosen as a pilot region for the crafting of a PRD. Funding was provided for international and local consultants to guide that process. Mr. Speaker, roundtable discussions were held in October of last year to apprise all of our RDCs as to the progress made in that process, and for those RDCs to learn from the experience of Region 10. Mr. Speaker, it is regrettable for me to inform this honourable members of this honourable House that that activity was boycotted by the opposition-controlled coastland RDCs, Mr. Speaker. So whilst we are seeking a strategic and meaningful engagement with the RDCs, Mr. Speaker, and not a superficial one, whilst we are asking our RDCs to identify your development needs and priorities, what we are doing is we are discharging our obligation, Mr. Speaker. And the question is, will the opposition-controlled councils step up, or will they stay out of the process and criticize?
You have 2 minutes remaining on.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce, however, that at the second roundtable conference that was held 1 week ago, that there was full participation from all of the opposition-controlled regions at the level of the regional chairman, Mr. Speaker. So I believe that they are now seeing the wisdom of collaborating with this process and of seeking to take advantage of the offer of support to the crafting of the 2016 proposals of their PRD. Mr. Speaker, the 2016 allocations proposes a further $6 billion for our 10 regions. It increases that figure, the 2015 figure, from 26 million to 32 billion, Mr. Speaker, an increase of 23%. These increases varied in the regions, Mr. Speaker, from 13% in Region 10, the lowest, to 37% in Region 8. 13% in Region 10 to 37% in Region 8, an average of 23%. Mr. Speaker, that is ample proof that this administration, that Budget 2016 is investing in the development of our regions. Mr. Speaker, that is the proof of the pudding. Mr. Speaker, the honorable members on the opposite side sees no good in this budget. But figures don't lie, Mr. Speaker. We're all entitled to our facts, but we're entitled to our opinion, but not to facts. Mr. Speaker, in closing, this budget invests in hinterland development. This budget invests in community development. Budget 2016 invests in people's development. Budget 2016 invests in Guyana's development. It is for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, that I commend this budget to this honorable House and urge its unanimous approval. Thank you.